In early 1915, the Vosges mountain formed the physical border between France and the German Empire, a ridge of ancient peaks running north to south through Alsace. Along this mountainous frontier, 4 peaks would become the site of some of the most brutal fighting of the Vosges front. The Kleinkopf, rising to 950 meters, offered commanding views of the Münster Valley below. Just to its north stood the Barrenkopf, connected by a narrow ridge that would become critical to the defense of the entire sector. Further north, the Schratzmännele presented steep, forested slopes that made any assault a nightmare of vertical climbing under fire. And finally, the Lingekopf itself, the mountain that would give its name to the entire battle, overlooked both the Orbe Valley to the north and the Vecht Valley to the west. Just for context, we're walking up towards the Kleinkopf through the Barrenkopf positions across the Schratzmännele until we're reaching the Lingekopf. From the very beginning, the terrain favored whoever held the high ground, and in February 1915 that meant the Germans. This is what remains of those positions, and this is the story of the ground itself. When war broke out in August 1914, French forces immediately pushed into the Münster Valley, part of a broader offensive aimed at reclaiming Alsace from German control. The German troops in the area were relatively few in number and fell back in the face of this initial French advance. By late August, however, the situation had changed dramatically. French commanders received orders to withdraw their forces back to the border along the main Vosges crest, abandoning the ground they had just taken. This wasn't a tactical retreat, but rather a strategic redeployment, as much of the Alsatian army was being sent north to participate in the Battle of the Marne, where they would help stop the German advance on Paris. In the Vecht Valley, the front line stabilized in a loose and irregular pattern, with French forces holding the mountain ridges, while German troops positioned themselves further east in the valley below. In February 1915, German forces launched a heavy offensive in the Vecht Valley, with the specific goal of pushing French units back to the 1914 border. This offensive succeeded, and German troops occupied the Lingekopf ridge, establishing positions along the entire massif. Faced with this threat, 2 French divisions launched a joint offensive in spring of 1915. After weeks of heavy fighting, they succeeded in forcing German units to retreat from some of their advanced positions. The Battle of the village of Metzeral in June 1915 was particularly brutal, with the town changing hands multiple times before finally falling to the French. Despite these local successes, French General Joffre remained fixated on his original plan to take Münster by capturing the Lingekopf ridge. This would require an enormous amount of preparation, all of which would have to be conducted within sight of German observation posts. The logistical challenge was immense. Roads had to be constructed where none existed, including a 12-kilometer mountain road built entirely under forest cover to avoid German artillery fire. Mule trails needed to be expanded and improved. Barracks had to be erected to house the thousands of troops who would participate in the assault. Artillery positions needed to be surveyed, prepared, and stocked with ammunition. Communication trenches had to be dug to allow reinforcements and supplies to reach the front lines without exposure to enemy fire. All of this work took months, and none of it could be hidden from German observers on the heights above. The Germans, seeing these preparations, responded by strengthening their own defenses. Pioneer companies carved trenches directly into the rock where soil was too shallow. Bunkers were constructed using concrete and reinforced masonry. Machine gun positions were sited to create interlocking fields of fire across likely French approach routes. Barbed wire, thousands of meters of it, was strung between trees and around rock outcroppings, creating obstacles that would channel attacking infantry into predetermined killing zones. By mid-July 1915, both sides had completed their preparations and the stage was set for a battle that would rage for 3 months and cost thousands of lives without significantly altering the position of the front line. Standing at 950 meters above sea level, the Kleinkopf represented the lowest fortified point along the entire Lingekopf massif. From its summit, the entire Münster Valley spread out below, offering an unobstructed view of roads, villages, and any movement in the valley floor. This wasn't a position designed for mass combat, but rather for observation and coordination. German officers stationed here could direct artillery fire, report on French movements, and maintain visual contact with other positions along the ridge. The Germans fortified the Kleinkopf starting in early 1915, taking advantage of the sandstone geology that characterizes the entire massif. Sandstone is soft enough to be carved with hand tools, but hard enough to provide substantial protection against shrapnel and small caliber shells. During the major battles of July 1915, the Kleinkopf served primarily as a rallying point and a source of flanking fire. When French forces briefly captured the summit of the Barrenkopf on July 20th, German reserve units assembled here before launching a counterattack from the west. The approach trench that allowed this maneuver ran along the western slope of the Barrenkopf, a route that would have been exposed to French observation if not for the careful placement of the communication trenches just right here. This combination of observation capability and tactical flexibility made the Kleinkopf essential to German defensive operations, even though it wasn't the site of the most intense fighting. Looking at these fortifications today, you can see how the position was designed not just for defense, but for observation. These weren't crude field fortifications thrown up in a haste, but rather carefully engineered positions that took weeks to construct. The observation posts were connected to lower positions by communication trenches that ran along the ridge, with some sections covered to prevent French observers from detecting movement between positions. The trenches are mostly gone now. The Kleinkopf wasn't transformed by a single battle, but rather by months of continuous occupation and improvement. The positions visible today represent the cumulative effort of multiple German units rotating through the sector, each adding to improving what their predecessors had built. This incremental construction resulted in a defensive system that was both redundant and interconnected, capable of absorbing significant damage while maintaining its essential functions. When artillery destroyed one position, troops could fall back to another. When one communication trench was rendered impassable, alternative existed. This depth of preparation reflects the German doctrine, which emphasized the holding of key terrain through mutually supporting positions rather than relying on single, heavily fortified strongpoints. Moving from the Kleinkopf toward the Barrenkopf, the trail follows the ridge line that connected these two positions during the war. This route would have been used for communication between the positions and for moving reserves from one threatened point to another during the July 1915 battles. The forest provides cover from observation from the west, which is one reason this route was viable during the war despite being relatively close to French positions, approximately just 20 to 30 meters. Along this section of trail, you can see more evidence of the trench systems that connected the positions. Some sections show clear traces of communication trenches cut into the slope, while in other places the route follows what appears to be a natural fold in the terrain, but which may have been enhanced or modified to provide cover. The transition from the Kleinkopf to the Barrenkopf involves a slight descent and then a small climb, with the Barrenkopf summit rising ahead through the trees. This approach gives you a sense of how the positions relate to each other tactically. The Barrenkopf represented the right anchor of the German defensive line, and both sides understood that if this position fell, the entire Münster Valley position would become untenable. German commanders treated its defense as an absolute priority, while French planners identified it as key objective that had to be taken if any breakthrough was to be achieved. The positions that remain here today are among the best preserved anywhere on the Lingekopf massif, testimony both to the quality of their original construction and to the importance placed on their defense. What strikes you immediately about the Barrenkopf fortifications is the quality of the engineering. These aren't improvised fieldworks, but rather carefully planned and precisely executed defensive positions. The trenches follow the natural contours of the ground, taking advantage of folds in the terrain to create natural drainage and to minimize exposure to enemy observation. The construction materials themselves speak to the level of preparation. The trench walls consist of carefully laid stone blocks, fitted together with minimal mortar gaps and reinforced with concrete where additional strength was needed. Some sections show multiple layers of construction, with an original stone wall later reinforced with poured concrete, suggesting that these positions were continuously improved even after the initial construction was complete. The Barrenkopf bunkers, like the machine gun bunker we've seen at the beginning, demonstrate even more sophisticated engineering. Their profiles are deliberately kept low to minimize the visibility from French observation posts, while their roofs are built thick enough to withstand direct hits from all but the heaviest shells. The firing slits are built to cover specific sectors without exposing the interior to enemy fire, and the interior spaces, though cramped and dark, are designed with just enough room for machine gun crew to operate effectively, along with storage for ammunition and basic supplies. The importance of the Barrenkopf is reflected in the density of fortifications. Compared to other sections of the line, there are simply more positions per meter of front and more reinforcement. When French artillery pounded these positions for hours on end during the July 1916 battles, the fortifications suffered massive damage. Trenches collapsed under the impact of heavy shells and mines. Yet the positions held, barely in some cases, but they held. German troops sheltered in deeper dugouts and galleries during the bombardment, then emerged to man their firing positions when the French infantry advanced. The engineering allowed this to happen, and that engineering is what you're looking at today, still standing after more than a century. Between the Barrenkopf and the Schratzmännele lies a saddle of relatively open ground known as La Courtine, and understanding the tactical significance of this terrain feature is essential to understanding why the battles here were so costly. Mostly at night, both sides sent out patrols to probe the wire obstacles and listening posts to detect enemy movement. Flares would suddenly illuminate the darkness, freezing men in place or sending them scrambling for cover. Machine guns would sweep across the meadow at irregular intervals, firing at suspected assembly areas or movement. During the major battles of July 1915, La Courtine became the scene of repeated French attempts to break through, with each assault leaving the ground covered with dead and wounded who often couldn't be recovered until nightfall, if they could be recovered at all. Adjacent to La Courtine, up a steep hill, the Kleiner Schratzsteinbruch, or Little Schratz Quarry, presented a different kind of tactical problem. This was a site where, before the war, stone had been cut and transported down to the valleys below for construction. The Protestant church in Münster, built between 1867 and 1873, was constructed using sandstone blocks quarried from these very slopes. When war came, what had been a commercial operation became a military position. The quarry offered natural walls that provided cover, and its elevated position gave defenders good fields of fire over the approaches. The Germans fortified the quarry, incorporating it into their defensive system. The French recognized that taking the quarry would be essential to any successful assault on the Schratzmännele, and on July 29, 1915, units of the 15th Bataillon de Chasseurs à Pied made a determined attempt to capture it. In one of the more remarkable tactical improvisations of the battle, French troops hauled a 75mm field gun up the slope by hand, positioning it where it could fire directly into the quarry at point-blank range. The assault succeeded in capturing the position, but the French couldn't hold it against German counterattacks. The quarry changed hands, then changed back, and by the time the fighting subsided, both sides were exhausted and the Germans had re-established control. The route from the quarry up to the main Schratzmännele positions climbs through forest that shows extensive evidence of wartime activity. The trees here are younger than in some other areas, suggesting that the forest was more heavily damaged during the war and took longer to recover. The ground is very uneven, marked by what are almost certainly shell craters that have been partially filled in by decades of leaf accumulation, but that still show as depressions in the forest floor. Linear features that appear to be trench lines cut across the slope at various angles, some of them quite well preserved, while others have eroded almost to the point of invisibility. Scattered among these features are what might be bunker entrances or dugout sites, though most of them have collapsed to the point where it's difficult to be certain without excavation. The density of this evidence increases as you approach the summit area, indicating that the Schratzmännele was heavily fortified and that the fortifications extended well below the summit positions themselves. The Schratzmännele, which German soldiers shortened simply to Schratz, presented perhaps the most challenging terrain on the entire Lingekopf massif. Its western slopes, where the French would have to attack from, were not just steep, but extremely steep, covered in dense forest that restricted visibility to a few meters in many places. The southern slopes were somewhat more gradual, but still presented significant obstacles to any assault. The summit itself became a tangled maze of trenches, bunkers, communication trenches, and fortified positions that grew more complex with each month of the war. The trench systems on the Schratzmännele were among the most extensive on the massif. German doctrine called for multiple lines of defense, with a first line where the initial contact with attacking French forces would occur, a second line positioned further back to serve as a fallback position if the first line was penetrated, and communication trenches connecting these positions to allow reinforcement and resupply. What made the Schratzmännele unique among the positions on the Lingekopf massif was the extreme proximity of French and German trenches. In some sectors, the distance between the two sides was only 15 to 20 meters, close enough that soldiers could hear normal volume conversations in the enemy trenches and could definitely hear orders being shouted or equipment being moved. The battles of July 1915 transformed the Schratzmännele into one of the most contested pieces of ground in the entire Vosges mountains. French forces attacking from the west had to climb uphill through forest, under fire, from defenders who held superior positions and who had spent months preparing those positions. The assaults repeatedly stalled, with French troops dying in the wire obstacles in the forest glades or in the brief sections of communication trench they managed to capture before being driven back by German counterattacks. The fighting here wasn't conducted at long range, but rather at close quarters, with men seeing the faces of those they were fighting, hearing names being shouted, and engaging in combat that was intensely personal despite being part of a massive industrial war. After the July battles concluded and the front stabilized, the Schratzmännele didn't become quiet at all. Daily grenade exchanges were routine, with both sides throwing grenades across the narrow no-man's land simply to harass the enemy or to prevent working parties from improving positions. Sniper duels occurred whenever someone was careless enough to expose themselves during daylight. Occasional raids were launched by both sides, usually at night, with small groups of men crawling through the wire to attack a section of enemy trench, take prisoners if possible, and then withdraw before reinforcements could arrive. This pattern continued through 1916, 1917 and into 1918, with units rotating in and out the sector, but the positions themselves remaining essentially unchanged. Moving from the Schratzmännele toward the Lingekopf through the so-called Lingesattel, you're following a route that would have been part of the connection between these two key German positions. The trail passes through areas that show clear evidence of having been developed during the war, with widened sections that might have been used for assembly areas or for positioning reserves, and with traces of structures that might have been command posts or storage facilities. The forest character changes slightly as you approach the Lingekopf, becoming more park-like in areas where memorial development has occurred. The transition from the undeveloped battlefield of the Schratzmännele to the more preserved and accessible battlefield of the Lingekopf is gradual but noticeable. The Lingekopf itself, the mountain that gave its name to the entire battle, stands at the northern end of the massif and commands views over both the Orbey Valley to the north and the Fecht Valley to the west. Of all the peaks along this ridge, the Lingekopf represented the most significant tactical objective. Taking it would open up to the Münster Valley to French forces and would potentially threaten the entire German position in the southern Vosges mountains. Losing it would mean that French forces could dominate the approaches from multiple directions and could potentially roll up the German line from north to south. The positions visible today on the Lingekopf are more intact than those on the Barrenkopf, for example, primarily because this site has been developed as a memorial and museum since the 20s. Decades of work to make the battlefield accessible to visitors, combined with efforts to preserve certain positions while clearing vegetation from others, have altered the site significantly from its 1918 configuration. What isn't immediately visible but was essential to the German defense were the galleries that tunneled deep into the mountain. These underground spaces served multiple functions. Some were simply storage chambers where ammunition, food and other supplies could be kept safe from artillery fire. Others were command posts where officers could coordinate the defense without being exposed to enemy fire. Still others were deep shelters where troops could wait out bombardments, emerging to mend the firing positions only when French infantry began their assault. French planning for the assault on the Lingekopf began in June 1915 with detailed reconnaissance of the German positions and careful coordination between infantry and artillery. The plan called for massive preliminary bombardment to destroy German fortifications and cut the wire obstacles, followed by infantry assaults from multiple directions simultaneously to prevent the Germans from concentrating their defense at any single point. French did make progress in the initial assault. Some units succeeded in breaking through the wire obstacles and fighting their way into German trenches. In certain sectors, French troops actually reached the summit and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with German defenders. But they couldn't consolidate these gains. German counterattacks, supported by reserves brought up from positions further east, pushed the French back in some areas while containing them in others. What followed was a back-and-forth struggle that lasted for weeks, with positions being taken, lost and retaken multiple times, and with men from both sides dying for control of individual trenches or bunkers that might change hands several times in a single day. By mid-August, French forces controlled portions of the western slopes of the Lingekopf, but the Germans still held the key positions along the summit and the eastern approaches. The line stabilized in this configuration, with both sides consolidating their positions and preparing for a winter in the mountains. In November 1915, the Germans launched a final major push aimed at reclaiming some of the ground they had lost, and they succeeded in pushing the French back in some sectors, though not all. After this November fighting, the line remained essentially frozen until 1918, with neither side launching any further major offensives in this sector. The transformation on the Lingekopf into a memorial site began almost immediately after the armistice. French veterans organizations and local officials recognized the historical significance of the battlefield and worked to preserve portions of it while making it accessible to visitors. Trenches were cleared of debris and stabilized. Bunkers were made safe. Paths were marked. Over the decades, the site became one of the most visited Great War battlefields in Alsace, with a museum, monuments and regular commemorative events. This preservation work means that the Lingekopf today looks different from how it appeared in 1918, but it also means that visitors can get a sense of what trench warfare in the mountains was like in a way that isn't possible at sites where nature has been allowed to reclaim everything. But let's get a little into detail on what happened here in summer 1915, because what unfolded on these slopes wasn't just another forgotten skirmish. It was a meat grinder that showed exactly why mountain warfare was different and why holding high ground mattered more than artillery tonnage. July 20th, 1915, the first assault. 5 a.m. French artillery opens up. 9 hours of systematic bombardment, every caliber, 75mm field guns, heavy howitzers and mortars. The mountain transforms into smoke and flying debris. Trees were cut down, trenches obliterated and bunkers blown. But there's the thing, many shells detonated in the forest canopy, not on the ground. The concrete bunkers held. The wire obstacles are cut in places but remain functional enough to channel attackers into kill zones. 2 p.m. Final 30-minute intensification, then silence. French Alpine troops, specialists in mountain warfare, emerge from Glassborn and advance. German machine guns and rifles open fire. The assault stalls almost immediately. Heavy casualties, then the French fall back. (3:30 p.m. The second attack, 5 successive waves. At the Schratzmännele, the French run straight into Captain Pausch's 5th Company, a newly dug trench that French intelligence hadn't detected. Because it's new, it wasn't hit by the bombardment. The attack collapses. And exactly here, where we are now, it got personal. A French breakthrough, hand-to-hand fighting in the trenches. Lieutenant Préhuber throws himself at the attackers with a small group from the 9th Company. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, he was shot at close range. Oberleutnant Vogt moves forward to reinforce the line. A heavy shell lands directly on his group. He's buried alive. They dig his disfigured body out the next day. Lieutenant Hornig, same company, also killed. With their officers gone and positions collapsing, the 9th Company breaks. Men fall back. But no matter what they tried, the French couldn't break through. July 22nd, round 2, but even worse. The French try again, concentrating on the Barrenkopf. 11 a.m., new level of intensity. 15, 22 and 28 centimeter shells hit the ground. Heavy mines tearing enormous craters. Trees were felled by the dozens. Dugouts collapsed, burying the occupants. Trenches disappeared into overlapping craters. The 11th and 12th companies on the verge of collapse. Hauptmann Ruidisch, 11th Company commander, was killed rallying his men. Lieutenant Hönig, 12th Company, was killed setting an example. 11:30 a.m. French attack while bombardment continues. Vizefeldwebel Faustich machine guns create flanking fire. Oberleutnant Jakob counterattacks from the Schratzmännele heights. At the Barrenkopf, the situation was critical. French advanced to 200 meters from the Badener Hütte command post. The regimental commander again leads personally, ordering all available troops forward. At 5 p.m. all positions were restored. That night, working parties at the northern edge of the Lingekopf find another 50 French soldiers hiding in shell craters, mostly lightly wounded. Not a single intact trench section remained on the Lingekopf massif. The terrain was transformed into overlapping craters. But these 2 days proved even the most intensive artillery preparation couldn't guarantee success against properly prepared positions held by determined troops. The French launched well-planned attacks with specialist mountain infantry. They achieved initial breakthroughs, but they couldn't exploit them. The tactical lesson was brutal and clear. In mountain warfare, the defender holds nearly all advantages. Dislodging him requires either overwhelming superiority or a fundamentally different approach. Neither side had either. So the fighting would continue without any realistic prospect of a decisive outcome. After the conclusions of the major battles in summer and October 1915, the Alpine battalions that had borne the brunt of the French assault were gradually withdrawn from the Vosges sector and redeployed to other parts of the front where the specialized training was needed. Line infantry units took their place, soldiers who hadn't received the specific mountain warfare training of the Alpine troops, but who were nevertheless expected to hold the positions that had been won at such cost. For the Germans, a similar process occurred, with specialized mountain units being moved to other sectors and regular Landwehr formations taking over the routine business of holding the line. The Vosges front officially became what military planners referred to as a rest sector, a place where units could be sent to recover from heavy fighting elsewhere, or where new formations could be broken into trench warfare under relatively calm conditions. Both sides continued to work on their fortifications throughout this period. The Germans, with their superior logistical situation and their generally stronger engineering traditions, expanded and improved their positions continuously. The system of trenches, bunkers and galleries became more complex with each passing month. More concrete was brought up and poured over existing stonework. More galleries were driven into the rock. More wire was strung. The Germans also developed the positions that they held since 1915 into what they called Fort Lingekopf, a designation that reflected the. In 1917, even American units began arriving in the sector, with the 5th, 6th and 35th US Infantry Divisions all spending time on the Lingekopf front. These troops were there primarily to gain experience in trench warfare under conditions where the risk was lower than it would be in more active sectors. They conducted patrols, participated in the daily routine of trench life, and suffered the same steady attrition from snipers and artillery that affected all units in the sector. In July 1918, an American patrol conducted a raid near Sondernach in the Vecht Valley, a small action that drew little attention, but that was typical of the kind of small unit operations that characterized this period of the war. The Lingekopf front never saw another major battle after 1915. The positions established during that year's fighting remained essentially unchanged until the armistice in November 1918. The same trenches, the same bunkers, the same wire obstacles that had been there in late 1915 were still there 3 years later, maintained and improved but fundamentally unaltered. Right up until the final day of the war, men continued to die on these slopes, killed in small actions or by random shell fire or by snipers, dying slowly and steadily in a sector that military planners had decided wasn't worth another major offensive. The line was frozen, and it would remain frozen until the war itself ended. Walking down through the forest below the peaks, you begin to encounter scattered remnants of positions that were never as heavily fortified as those on the summits. These are the traces of reserve lines, communication trenches and supply routes that connected the frontline positions to the valleys below. The trenches here are half collapsed, their original depths obscured by decades of leaf litter that has slowly filled them in. Stone walls that once formed the parapets of firing positions are barely visible now, covered with moss and partially buried under accumulating soil and forest debris. In this terrain you can still find artifacts of the war, though they're increasingly rare as collectors and souvenir hunters have combed these slopes for decades. Wire, rusted into the soil but still recognizable, can sometimes be found embedded in tree bark where it had been slowly engulfed as the tree grew. Shell fragments, pieces of equipment, occasionally even intact shells or grenades that failed to explode and that now pose a danger to anyone unlucky enough to disturb them. These physical traces are important because they are tangible evidence of what happened here. Objects you can touch and hold that connected directly to the experiences of the men who fought in these positions. The preservation of battlefield sites like the Lingekopf presents ongoing challenges. On the summit, where the site has been developed as a memorial, the trenches and bunkers are maintained, cleared of vegetation and stabilized to prevent further deterioration. This preservation work is important because it allows people to visit and to get some sense of what these positions looked like. But it also inevitably changes the site, making it cleaner and more organized than it ever was during the actual fighting. Down here in the forest, away from the maintained positions, you get a different and in some ways more authentic picture. This is how most of the Western Front looks today, not museums and monuments, but simply ground that remembers, where the traces of the war are slowly disappearing beneath new growth, but haven't yet disappeared completely. The major battles of July through October 1915 resulted in roughly 17,000 casualties, killed and wounded, divided between French and German forces. After those battles ended, the fighting continued at a lower intensity, but with a grim consistency that produced thousands more casualties over the following 3 years. All of this sacrifice, all of this bloodshed resulted in almost no change to the positions of the front line. Münster remained in German hands until the armistice. The strategic situation at the end of the war was essentially what it had been at the beginning. The men who fought here didn't fight for grand strategic objectives or for sweeping military victories. They fought because they were ordered to, because their comrades were beside them and abandoning those comrades was unthinkable, because once you're in the middle of combat, there often isn't any choice but to fight or die. What they left behind are the scars in the earth, the structures built to wage industrial warfare in mountainous terrain, and an enormous silence that settled over these heights when the guns finally stopped firing. The forest has returned, but the ground beneath it remembers everything. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you're familiar with this location or if you've been there yourself. I always appreciate your critique and suggestions for future sites to cover. Have a wonderful week and see you.